Kara leaned against the wall, her eyes half lidded with boredom, as the guy in front of her continued to rattle off his latest gym achievements. His voice was a constant hum in the background of the party, like an overzealous mosquito that just wouldn't quit. She gave a tight-lipped smile, nodding when appropriate, though her mind had wandered far beyond the conversation. The house was packed, the air thick with a mixture of sweat, perfume, and the sharp tang of alcohol. People moved around her in swaying groups, laughing loudly, music pulsing through the walls. She had hoped for a more exciting evening, but so far, the night had been one long slog of avoiding one tedious interaction after another. As the guy launched into yet another tale of his workout routine, Kara's patience wore thin. "Hey, I'm gonna go get another drink," Kara interrupted, her tone light but with enough urgency to make it clear she needed an out. The guy paused mid-sentence, blinking as if he'd just realized she wasn't paying attention. "Oh yeah, sure. I'll catch you later." "Yeah, sure," she muttered, already turning away before he could say anything else. She weaved through the crowded room, exhaling as soon as she was free from the conversation. "All men are dogs, I swear," Kara muttered to herself, rolling her eyes as she made her way through the throng of partygoers. The irritation still buzzed in the back of her mind, but she pushed it down. She just needed to calm down. Maybe a drink would help take the edge off. Spotting the empty kitchen ahead, Kara breathed a sigh of relief. At least it was quiet in there. She slipped into the room, the noise from the rest of the house dulling slightly as the door clicked shut behind her. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, and for a moment, she relished the solitude. Kara headed toward the counter, eyeing the half-empty bottles scattered across it. "What'll it be?" she muttered under her breath, scanning the options. Anything strong would do. She just wanted to forget the endless string of guys who thought they could impress her with empty words and inflated egos. After a few moments of searching, Kara's eyes landed on a hidden stash of alcohol up high on a shelf above the counter. Jackpot. A small grin tugged at the corners of her lips as she realized there was still hope for salvaging her night. She stepped closer, eyeing the sleek bottles tucked away just out of reach. Excitedly, Kara leaned over the counter, stretching her arm as far as she could. Her fingers grazed the edge of one of the bottles, but no matter how much she strained, it stayed just beyond her grasp. She cursed under her breath, determined not to be outsmarted by a liquor shelf. As she stretched higher, her tight dress rode up ever so slightly, revealing a small peek of her smooth skin. She didn't notice, too focused on the promise of a drink, until she suddenly felt something cold and wet pressing between her cheeks. Kara jumped, gasping as the shock of the sensation sent her heart racing. She spun around quickly, her face flushing pink with embarrassment, as she hurriedly pulled her dress back down, her hands gripping the fabric tightly. The dog stood there, looking up at her innocently, its tail wagging as if nothing unusual had just happened. "Bad dog," she muttered, still holding onto the bottom of her dress as she tried to compose herself. "Don't sneak up on me like that." The dog just wagged its tail harder, oblivious to her frustration. Kara let out an exasperated sigh, shaking her head. "Ugh, you men are all the same," she muttered, still flustered as she stood there. "Woof you for... woof! Bark!" Her hands shot up from the seams of her dress to cover her mouth, her heart pounding in shock. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the bizarre situation. The dog still wagging its tail seemed unfazed by her outburst, as if it had all been perfectly normal. Without realizing it, the base of her dress began to lift slightly, moved by something new. A small tail, sprouting from the very spot where the dog's cold nose had touched her. The tail flicked gently, but Kara was completely unaware of the strange transformation happening behind her. Her focus was still on the odd outburst she had earlier, the strange feeling still fresh in her throat. She slowly lowered her hands from her mouth, letting out a shaky breath as she tried to compose herself. Testing her voice, she spoke softly. "Did I just—" Small, fluffy brown ears began to poke through her blonde hair, twitching slightly as if reacting to her confusion. They moved ever so subtly, matching the nervous energy that had crept into her posture. But Kara, still lost in the haze of her growing confusion, remained completely unaware of the changes. She tugged at the seams of her dress, trying to adjust it back down properly, her movements becoming more frantic as she stumbled over her words. Bark? Woof! Her voice caught in her throat again, the strange bark-like sound slipping out against her will. Kara's eyes went wide with panic. Her head snapped down, looking toward the dog nervously, as if somehow expecting it to answer her, to explain what was happening. The dog, still wagging its tail happily, stared back up at her with those same curious eyes. There was something almost understanding in its gaze, something that unsettled her even further. Kara tugged at the seams of her dress, trying to regain some sense of control. But then, something caught her attention, a strange sensation at the back of her dress. It felt like it was being lifted, tugged upward by an unseen force. Her heart skipped a beat as she slowly turned her head, her eyes widening in horror at the sight behind her. The base of her dress was raised, resting unnaturally above her waist. She froze, staring at the tail that had sprouted there, flicking slightly as if it belonged to her. What's happening?" she stammered, her voice shaking as she let go of her dress. As soon as she released it, the fabric shot upwards, rising well above her waist, now resting fully on top of the new tail. Her face flushed with panic and confusion as she looked down and caught sight of her rear. Her mouth fell open. "My ass is huge!" she exclaimed, her hands moving instinctively to her now much larger butt. It had doubled in size, curving out behind her in a way that was completely impossible. The sheer weight and size of it made her wobble slightly on her feet, leaving her even more unbalanced and confused. Before she could process what was happening, a new sensation began to spread. It started as a faint tickle between her cheeks, then intensified, almost like a creeping warmth. Horrified, Kara glanced down again and saw dark fur beginning to spread from between her cheeks, slowly covering her skin and creeping outward. The soft fur was thick, almost like the coat of an animal, blending into her new tail as it swayed gently behind her. Her breath quickened as the fur continued to grow, spreading over her hips and down her thighs. The strange sight left her frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend the surreal transformation that was overtaking her body. As Kara sat on the floor, her legs having morphed into hind limbs, she tried desperately to regain some semblance of control. Her scream pierced the air as she fell onto her hands, her knees buckling under the pressure of her new form. The sudden jolt ripped her dress further, exposing even more fur now spreading across her skin. Her attempts to stand were futile. Her body no longer moved as a human's did. Her balance, her form, it was all wrong. "I can't stand!" she cried out, voice cracking with desperation. She collapsed again, sitting back onto her hind legs, her front paws awkwardly between her thighs, the fur creeping up her arms and up her back, the sensation a maddening mix of alien and familiar. She could feel the fur now crawling up her neck, covering her face, sealing away her last human features. Her nose began to tingle and grow cold, and she instinctively brought a paw to her face, feeling the smooth, wet surface of a black canine nose where her once human one had been. Her reflection in the gleaming surface of the fridge startled her. She was no longer the woman she'd been. Her body was that of a pet, covered in sleek fur, her face elongated, her nose twitching with new enhanced senses. The transformation was complete. Her lips quivered with fear, her tail curling tightly between her legs as she tried to grasp what was left of her humanity. "Oh, God, she whimpered, her voice barely recognizable, tinged with a mix of despair and disbelief. My body, what's happened to... Ow! Her words dissolved into a scream as her gaze caught the movement behind her. The dog had moved closer, circling around her. Its presence was both unsettling and strangely comforting, a constant reminder of what she had become. She flinched as it got close to her, its curious eyes watching her closely. She tried to coo softly, the human in her knowing of the male dog's plans. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, though her voice trembled with fear. The dog didn't hesitate, tugging at the last shreds of her ruined dress, ripping it from her fur-covered body. "Hey, my dress!" Kara yelped, but it was a half-hearted protest. Her attention was now focused on the dog as it circled behind her, its face nearing her backside. "What are you... Oh! I..." Her words were cut off as she let out a sudden, deep breath, her body reacting in ways she hadn't anticipated. Pleasure coursed through her in warm waves, her face flushing a deep pink as she realized what was happening. The sensation sent a shiver down her spine, and she couldn't hold back the soft, breathy whisper that escaped her lips. "Oh, good doggy," she murmured, her voice sultry and low, almost instinctual. The fear she'd felt moments before melted away, replaced by an overwhelming heat that spread through her body. The confusion, the terror, all of it faded into the background as her new form responded to the animalistic desires awakening within her,